Those of boldest blood and wildest heart step forth. Take up arms and try with honor to land a blow against me. Whomsoever nicks me shall lay claim to this my arm. Its glory and riches shall be thine. Should you land a blow, you must seek me out yonder 1 year hence to the green chapel, and let me strike you in return. Who is willing to indulge me in this game? Hi, I'm BJ, and this is the Arcane Alienist Podcast. In this episode, we're going to cover the Green Knight film from A24 Studios, starring Dev Patel. So it's a bit of a longer episode than I normally do, and there's a couple of rough cuts, and we recorded this in my kitchen, so at some point, I think you can hear a plane fly overhead, and towards the end, you hear the ice cream truck coming down the street, and there's some other pet noises here and there, so I apologize for that. I don't have any ability to edit those out. But there are spoilers for the movie. We are going to talk about the movie in comparison to the original poem that it's based on. And I will do a review of the actual Green Knight role-playing game that is a tie-in to the film here coming up pretty soon. But I'm just going to let this one be dedicated to our discussion of the film with my guest, Dr. Sarah Peters. So here we go. Okay, today I am joined by Dr. Sarah Peters of East Central University in Ada, Oklahoma, and you have a fairly new position, right?
Yes.
You just started last year?
Yes, I am Interim Associate Provost and Dean of Graduate Studies.
Wow, okay. But before that you were in the English department, right?
Yeah, so I have a PhD in English, and I've been an English professor for several years.
All right. Cool. And I know we're going to talk about the Green Knight and Arthurian stuff, but is there a particular area of literature that you tend to specialize in?
Yeah,
in your teaching?
I did not specialize in early English literature, but my specialization is 20th century American literature. But I've also done a lot of work on adaptations and retellings, and so in particular, like how contemporary novels or drama or film have taken old stories, myths, fairy tales, biblical stories, and reimagined them and retold them. And I think I like the word retelling better than adaptation, because I think there's a transformation that happens when you take something from its original culture and then put it in a whole new cultural environment, and it takes on a lot of great meaning. But there's also something important about that attachment to that older work and why it's chosen. Yeah,
I know. Probably most of the people that listen to my podcast are all D&D players and other role-playing games and comic book fans and Star Trek and Star Wars fans, and we get pretty picky about how things get adapted and whether we feel like it's been a satisfactory adaptation of the source material or not. So, and when I first started talking about the movie, you'd said, though, you had a particular, you'd written something on the Green Knight some time back, or I remember you saying that had some kind of special.
So I haven't written about the Green Knight, but it was when I was an undergrad and taking British literature, it was one of the earliest courses that I took in this field that I ended up, studying for many, many years. And the Green Knight was one of my favorite texts from the early English literature. It was really striking to me. I really enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. I loved the magic of it, and I loved the kind of chivalry, and I kind of liked I like Arthurian legend in general and how it has been picked up in so many different ways. It's been transformed and retold more than, you know, a lot of other kind of threads of mythology. And there's all these different directions it's gone in. And I really like the focus on, you know, this one knight and his journey.
Yeah, it tends to be a crowded cast. In other adaptations, it's either just Arthur and Merlin, or you kind of get little snippets of. I kind of sometimes think it was it 84 Excalibur, the movie with. Was it Nigel Terry? There's like a lot of like I think Patrick Stewart and Gabriel Byrne and Liam Neeson. They all had early appearances, but it was sort of there were so many knights it just kind of bounced around. Once they kind of established Arthur's character, there are almost too many characters to keep up with.
Arthur is the center of a lot of the stories. Guinevere, maybe Lancelot.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get a great story about Merlin or Morgan, but I really you don't often have that sharp focus on what does it mean to be a knight from this perspective of this one person. I
kind of thought, unless I've missed a smaller film or something, I feel like that Excalibur was maybe the last attempt to just do a serious. Well, I was going to say adaptation, but maybe retelling of the actual literature. And since then, we've gotten, you know, this is some director's wild take on, well, what if the story of Arthur had happened this way? And so it seems like that was the last one up until, well, we can talk about whether The Green Knight is to what extent it's an adaptation or a retelling or whatever. But between this one and Excalibur, I can't remember any other Arthurian movies that were really made any attempt to kind of be a faithful retelling of, if not the story, at least kind of the spirit of.
Yeah. Well, and I kind of haven't followed the more recent Arthurian movies after, I think, First Night.
Yeah, I'm thinking of that one. It was pretty egregious.
Yeah, like that was kind of one where I thought, I think I'm bored with this now. I don't.
Yeah, I haven't watched the Guy Ritchie one that came out a couple of years ago. I didn't even mess with that one, where Arthur's like a thief in London, you know, and it might be fun just because, hey, let's don't take this serious at all, which is kind of, I think, how you have to take Guy Ritchie movies. But
I really like, you know, it's not film. If you want to go back into literature, in the 19th century, you have the Pre-Raphaelites, and they are quite an interesting collection of poets and painters, you know, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Christina Rossetti, and Elizabeth Siddal, and you have and these figures did a lot of Arthurian retellings, and they were more likely to do this kind of close study of the personality of one knight and to really dive into a love story between two figures. And they also were, you know, they were willing to celebrate Guinevere's beauty and do these kind of homages to her, but also they were kind of willing to throw Guinevere under the bus and show her as like not a very nice person, and somebody who was willing to manipulate or willing to let other people suffer if it served her own devices. And that kind of critical view of Guinevere was interesting to me.
Yeah.
So there's a long tradition of kind of pushing back on that romanticized Arthurian legend.
Yeah. The only other Arthur movie I could think of that's kind of been modern is, I think it was called King Arthur several years ago. It was Clive Owen and Ian Gruffudd, and I think Keira Knightley played Guinevere. And it was supposed to be based on the theory that Arthur was a British Roman, I can't remember, Romano-British officer. And so then they kind of just constructed out from there. And it was also one of those where it's like it had a really great cast with great actors, but it just didn't quite come together. So, okay. Well, do you want to talk a little bit about the poem itself?
Sure. So
it's, what is this, like a 700-year-old?
It's late 14th century.
Yeah. So,
and it was passed around orally for a very long time.
So I don't think there's going to be spoilers for a 700-year-old poem. No. So, and I don't think you have to. For the film, I think you can know the story, the traditional story, without it ruining the experience of the film. But just in case anybody's listening and they don't want us to spoil a 700 whatever year old epic old English poem, you know, you can stop now listening to this episode. All right, so I'm gonna go through my understanding of the synopsis, and you tell me if I got it right.
All right.
Okay. So it's the story starts off. It's New Year's, which is I think technically part of the Christmas holiday back in that period, and it was actually probably more of when they actually had feasts and gift givings and things rather than Christmas Day. But Arthur is having a feast in his court, and all the knights are gathered around, and suddenly this figure that none of them know, the Green Knight, bursts in, and he challenges them to basically a contest of honor. That he has this huge axe, and he says, "I'll let any of you, whoever wants to, can strike a blow on me with this axe, but then in a year and a day, I get to return the favor." And none of the knights are willing to do this. So Arthur finally at last stirs to do it, and then Gawain intervenes and says, "I'll do it." And Gawain is Arthur's nephew, and I think at this point in the saga, he's the youngest of the Knights of the Round Table. So he steps up, and the Green Knight gets down on his knees, and he cuts his head off. And I think, well, that's the end of that. But then the knight stands up and grabs his head and presents it to Guinevere in a kind of a taunting way. And then reminds Gawain that, in a year and a day, you can find me in the Green Chapel, and I get to return the blow. And that's the end of the first part. And then, if I understand correctly, when the time comes for him to make the journey, it's a really short part of the poem, and they allude to him having all these adventures, but they don't really go into a lot of detail. They say a little bit about maybe where he might have gone throughout Britain to get to the Green Chapel. But then he gets near the Green Chapel, and he comes across a castle, which is the castle of Sir Bertilac, who's a knight, who invites him to stay. He's very near the Green Chapel, but it's not quite the appointed day. So he invites him to stay with him until the day comes. And Bertilac goes out hunting every day, and he says, "I'll make a deal with you. I'll give you whatever I find out on my hunts if you give me whatever you find while you stay here in my castle." So they make this agreement, and then every day when Bertilac leaves, Bertilac's wife tries to seduce Gawain, and all he'll ever allow her to do is give him a kiss. So when Bertilac comes back and presents whatever he's captured for the day, a deer or whatever he's hunted, then Gawain gives him a kiss in exchange. On the third day, she also gives him this sash that says, "This will protect you from any harm." This green sash. So when Bertilac comes back, he gives him the kiss, but he doesn't mention the sash. And then he goes off to face the Green Knight. He finds the Green Knight sharpening his axe, and the knight. He kneels down, the knight goes to blow, and he flinches, so the knight mocks him for being a coward. So he says, well, okay. So he assumes the position again, and I think there's 3 times where the knight tries, finally at last, he just holds still and lets the knight hit him, and the knight just nicks him, and then reveals that the Green Knight is actually Sir Bertilac, and this was all a ruse by Morgan Le Fay to just cause, chaos and to kind of scare Guinevere and to play a trick on Arthur and the knights. And that there's an old woman who lives with Bertilac and his wife that is never, just kind of mysteriously there. It turns out that's Morgan Le Fay. And that, but anyway, they do acknowledge that Gawain failed. He flinched, and but he also had this sash that was going to prevent him from actually losing his head. But Bertilac forgives him and says, well, you're still an honorable man. You've been honest. You're honest about this, and you came and kept the appointed date. So he goes back to Camelot, and Arthur and the knights all agree, yeah, you failed, but it was a lesson. And so then from that point on, all the knights wear a green sash to remember, to be like Gawain, to be honest and courageous and admit their failings and things like that. I think that was my remembering of the synopsis. Did I get it right?
Yeah, that's good.
Did I miss anything important?
No, he's yeah, it's a big Christmas feast, and the Green Knight actually carries a holly bough with him. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's an occasion for everybody to be gathered together. So in some ways, it's a device for an excuse for why everyone's together in this big spot where there's this really visible place where Gawain can step up and be tested. But it's also, a really major time marker in the year traditionally, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's this And so when you have to wait a year later, like there's a really clear time marker that everyone's waiting for Christmas. And it was passed around for a long time, orally, and then it was written, and even after it was written, it had no title for a long time. And so in some texts, the title is actually The Christmas Game. And then it took on its kind of permanent title of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And the film is just The Green Knight. Sir Gawain's name is in it. So.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting thing about names with the movie that we'll get to in a minute, I think. But one of the things and the movie doesn't make this any clearer, but I know we talked about was the difference between Gawain's mother, Morgause, and Morgan Le Fay. That Arthur has 3 half-sisters, older half-sisters, that are all, I think they're all kind of depicted as sorceresses. But in the retelling, modernly, we people tend to collapse them all into one figure of Morgan Le Fay. Well, it's Morgause who's actually the villainous one. And Morgan Le Fay is for a while, but towards the end of at least in Mallory, towards the end, she sort of reconciles with Arthur and becomes an ally. And it's Morgause is actually really the mother of Mordred, and, plays a trick on Arthur and seduces him before he knows who she is and all that. But that drives me crazy as one of those people who wants to see kind of the whole story told from the literature and the mythology that they do
they all have a good reason to hate Arthur and to want to push back against him and play tricks on him, like in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and sometimes like much more sinister and dangerous things. They're usually collapsed together, and which for this film adds an interesting dimension, because in the original poem, Morgan is not personally invested in Gawain. She's just making trouble. And there is a sense, I mean, people have been analyzing this and debating this for hundreds of years. But there is a kind of a sense, I think, of she is testing this knight, and he's going to learn a valuable lesson from this experience. And you said that, like, that he's learned a lesson. What lesson do you think is there? Like, what's the original? What's the takeaway from that original poem, do you think?
I think probably that these knights are called to be chivalrous and examples and perfect, but they're people. And in the end, they all have to acknowledge we make mistakes. Sometimes our courage fails us, but the honorable thing is to just acknowledge it and try harder.
Yeah, I really like...
And I thought that was kind of the lesson they took away.
I like the way that you said that.
That Gawain was actually afraid. He did it anyway, but he was afraid. And it's okay that he was afraid, because he still did what he was supposed to do.
Well, and when the story starts, he's already a very respected knight. People really admire him. He's fully welcomed into the Round Table, and he's a really stand-up guy. And people point to him as this person to be admired. Yeah, and he has these standards for himself. Like, he's a perfectionist. He has these very, very high standards of chivalry and bravery and honesty, and they're unreasonable standards to hold yourself to. And I think I like the way you said that something that he takes away from this is you can't have those standards of perfection for yourself and also be a human. That
is such a relevant today. I mean, that's a timeless. I mean, I probably in my career as a mental health professional have spent a significant amount of time just trying to get people to understand that you don't have to live up to these standards. It's okay to aspire to higher standards, but nobody expects you to live up to them 24/7, and it's okay if you make a mistake. You don't have to beat yourself up about it. And if your mistake has caused a problem, just try to fix the problem and do better.
Yeah. And I think in this way, Morgan isn't really a villain in this story. Like, she's a nuisance, and she's a troublemaker, but I don't know that she comes off as an evil villain in this story, because she she created this fun story, right?
Yeah.
For one thing, and everyone comes out okay.
Kind of like Loki in Norse mythology.
Yeah.
He wasn't originally a villain. He was just kind of a pot stirrer.
Yeah.
The other thing that it never occurred to me till the movie, when we can transition into the movie, I kind of know that Gawain he's Morgause's oldest son, and he's Arthur's nephew, but it never really occurred to me that before Mordred comes along, he's actually then technically the heir to the throne.
Yeah.
Because Arthur doesn't have any children, and he would be his oldest male nephew. And I think that theme gets picked up on in the movie a little bit.
Yeah, the film really plays that up, especially when they make Arthur so old. And that means in the original text, Arthur is still young, and he's going to be a leader for the foreseeable future. Nobody's trying to displace Arthur.
Yeah, I mean, he's much younger than his sisters, and then so his nephews would not be that much younger than him.
Yeah, and in this film, Arthur and Guinevere are very old, and you can really see he's getting towards the end, and I think that really intensifies the notion of Gawain being the heir.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, was there anything else you wanted to say about the actual poem before we talk more about the movie?
No, not in particular.
I did have one question, and this was just, obviously other media. I follow other podcasts and YouTube. A lot of people are talking about this. And somebody, I'm trying to remember where I heard it, said that there is in the Old English poem, there's a significant amount of time just spent discussing the nature of the color green. And I don't know if you recall that, or if... And the only reason it stuck out to me is there's a part in the movie where Bertilac's wife has this sort of soliloquy about the meaning of the color green, and I didn't know if they wrote that for the movie, or if that came from the poem.
Yeah, well, there's lots of critical attention done for like what does the color green mean, and that in the retelling in this film, there's a clear stance put forth. There's a lot of different interpretations put on the original text of what does the color green mean, who is the Green Knight, what is his function, and there's a pretty clear interpretation put forth, because there is a monologue in there. In this film, there's not a lot of talking in this film.
No,
and there is a monologue about green, and that I think puts a real ecological meaning to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely present in the source text, that the notion of nature and respecting nature, and the connectedness of humans with nature, and the need to respect it. That's definitely there in the source text. And it's I don't know, it might be politicized a little more in the film.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's transition to talking about the film. So now we're going to act real spoilers for the film. So anybody listening now who doesn't want the film spoiled yet, maybe wants to pause and come back later. So as far as the film, I have a couple of things here to maybe... I already mentioned Arthur's nephew. One thing I think we had talked about earlier was the fact that there's only 3 characters that have a name in this movie. If you don't know the story, you just kind of have to know that the king is King Arthur, and that the queen is Guinevere, and the guy kind of standing in the background with the long beard is Merlin. You have to know that the Gawain's mother is either Morgan Le Fay or Morgause, depending on how, because she fills both roles in the movie. But I think Gawain and Essel, the prostitute that he's kind of his sort of his girlfriend, and Winifred, Saint Winifred. Those are the only 3 characters that actually are given a name, and everybody else you just have to know. These are who they, that's who. This is this legendary figure that we're putting in the movie along with Gawain. So, what did you think of that? Did you think it was?
Winifred is not. Essel and Winifred are not in the poem.
Right, these are
Neither
completely...
one of them are.
I think I read somewhere there's a reference in the poem that he passes St. Winifred's Well, which is like a place
Yeah, it's a real, that's a passing location.
It's more like a landmark.
But he doesn't interact with a person.
Yeah.
Of Winifred. So, yeah, I think the addition of... So, Gawain's interaction with Winifred it does represent kind of the Saint Winifred story. Mm-hmm. That in her story, she wants to remain chaste, and a man pursues her, and when she escapes his effort to rape her, he beheads her, and then her head is restored by another hero. And so Gawain is that hero in this story, that he restores her head. And I think she's really tied closely to me with Essel, because it really deepens Gawain's character, and it completely reframes who he is. When we see him early on with this romantic relationship, in the poem he's very chaste, even when like the lady of the castle is trying to seduce him. He will have none of it. He keeps her at arm's length and is very reluctant to even allow the kiss. And he's a little more open to her advances.
I think one of the first things that probably jump out to people who are familiar with the original sources, that in the poem and in Arthurian tradition, Gawain is a model knight in most ways. And in this one, he's kind of a spoiled brat. Yeah. And by the end, he finds his honor. I guess the poem is more of a test of whether he'll keep his honor. And here, this is a guy that he really didn't have any honor. He just kind of inherited his status by being the king's nephew, and he's got to earn it on this kind of hero's journey he's on. But I thought the scene with Winifred is one of the few times he actually, he kind of stumbles through it, but he actually does pass the test that's put before him instead of failing it. Well, and I think he's rewarded for it.
The connection I see between Winifred and Essel in that is that he, we don't know. He's not that likable in the beginning. Yeah. He kind of, you could read him as a real spoiled jerk. He's not, we're not that sympathetic. And I do think that, the presence of his mother makes him more sympathetic, because she's really emotionally invested in him. And Dev Patel is just an extraordinary actor. And I think even in his eyes, that helps to evoke a little sympathy in me, because there is kind of a moral struggle there with him. Yeah. And so I think we see a little bit of you could see him as really using Essel for sexual gratification, but also he does seem to love her, and you get a little glimpse of that. And I think when he's there with Winifred, it really puts in relief the stakes of treating of this man treating a woman as a full human with dignity, or just seeing her as a body to be used for pleasure. And so when he is respectful of Winifred, and she has been victimized in this terrible way, it puts some light on his relationship with Essel and the kind of struggles that he has with what are you going to do, because he can't just be with her. He can't marry her because of class differences and all kinds of those kinds of rules.
Yeah. And they have a conversation about that. He's just kind of saying, would you make me your lady? And he's kind of non-committal. He's kind of like, he's just kind of telling her what's going to get her to shut up.
Yeah. And so when he meets Winifred, he sees the very worst potential outcome of this. Yeah. Right? Here's the worst thing that can happen if this relationship just continues in this destructive and abusive and manipulative way.
Yeah. I think it was interesting. This is one of the few times he passes the test that's put in front of him, but he fails and she gives him a second chance. She's like, wants him to get her head from the lake so she can be at rest. And he's like, well, what do you give me in return? And she's like, why would you even ask me that?
Yeah.
And then he's kind of like, yeah, that was probably, he kind of has that idea. It's a moment of him realizing, he should just do it because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And he's rewarded because he gets, I guess we back up early on, one of the first times he fails the test, he's got, in this one, the sash comes to him from the beginning from his mother, and she tells him, this is all a game, and you won't come to any harm if you wear the sash. So he's got the sash, and he's got the axe that he's supposed to take back to the Green Knight. And the first thing that happens, he encounters this kind of peasant on the road who asks him if he can spare some change, and he first he doesn't, and then he just kind of gives him just kind of a pittance, and then later this same guy and his friends rob him and take away the sash and the axe, and so he's lost the things he needs for his quest. But when he actually does right by Winifred, he gets he finds the axe. It's returned to him, and he passes the test. I also think the Winifred, I wonder if you saw any foreshadowing with the whole one. There's the theme of being beheaded, which he beheaded the Green Knight, and her story involves being beheaded, and then he's on his way to be beheaded. So I thought that was another kind of a foreshadowing there of the whole theme of getting your head chopped off.
Yeah.
So I also thought it was interesting that they used Alicia Vikander, who played Essel, also played Bertilak's wife.
Yeah.
Because there's not a lot of dialogue. There's not a lot of them sharing their inner thoughts or what's really going on through it's just a lot of facial expressions. And I didn't know between that and between the old woman in the castle being blindfolded, which when you see, one thing you see in the movie that isn't in the poem is Morgause, and I'm assuming that's Morgan and the other, I'm drawing a blank on their other sister's name. I'm assuming that's them summoning the Green Knight.
Right.
Like they have actually summoned the Green Knight and not to cause problems for Arthur, but actually almost like we know this is how we're going to test Gawain and get him to grow up.
Yeah, he's in a kind of failure to launch situation,
yeah.
right? He's just being irresponsible and young, and he doesn't want to be held to adult standards, but he also wants to be respected, and he wants to be invited to join the round table.
Yeah.
Like he wants the rewards, but he doesn't necessarily want the responsibility. Mm-hmm. And his mom is trying to push him out of the nest a little bit, like snap him into maturity.
Yeah. But anyway,
that's something that you see from the beginning, that you see her kind of conjuring things on the way, and that's not in the source poem. It's not really revealed until the end that Morgan's been pulling the strings, but you can see Gawain's mother engaging in this like several times throughout the film that reminds us that she's caring for him in a way.
Yeah, I thought kind of halfway through the film, things take a turn and you're like, is this really happening to him or is he having a hallucination? But I thought the fact that when he gets to the castle, the lord of the castle's wife looks like, he didn't really acknowledge it. I think there's maybe like a weird look. And I almost forgot it was this. I almost didn't pick up on it was the same actress. But also that the old woman is blindfolded, and you see Morgause and her sisters blindfold themselves when they cast the spell to summon the Green Knight. So there's these two cues that this seems to go back to, this isn't completely real. Of course, the film doesn't ever really tell you that it's not really real. It ends before where the poem ends. But I thought that was an interesting kind of callback to kind of let you know. You remember she said this is all a game. It's not real. Yeah. Do what you're supposed to do. Everything's going to work out. But he does lose his, in the poem, he does maintain his chastity. And in the movie, he doesn't. He finally gives in at the end. So I thought that was how do you think that changes the meaning of everything?
He's so much more flawed in the film And I think it makes him a more interesting character.
Certainly, yeah.
That he has these flaws that he's struggling with, and I think the theme of sexual exploitation is connected, I think, to the theme of exploiting the natural world, and that the arrogant belief that you can exploit a person, exploit nature, exploit situations and communities and all of these things without paying the consequences. And I think that comes even in the scene when the Christmas game is introduced, when the knight says, "Give me a blow and I'll return it in a year and a day." That Gawain doesn't have to behead the knight. He could give him a little scratch, and win the game, and not be harmed. Yeah. But he wants to win the game. He wants to show off in front of Arthur and the knights. And he wants to get the glory, but he doesn't want to pay the consequences. So he thinks, if I can behead this knight, there's no way I will ever pay the consequences for this, and I'm just going to get all the reward. Yeah,
you kind of add to that in the movie. The knight doesn't offer his axe; he just says, "Come, give me a blow," and King Arthur gives him Excalibur to do it with. So he actually, in the movie, he beheads him with Excalibur. And you're right, there was a sort of he probably could have just tapped him on the shoulder or give him a little nick. But instead he decided to, well, I've got Excalibur in my hand, I'm going to show off. And
that shows up in his relationship with Essel, and then in his interaction with the lady of the castle, that he doesn't want to pay the consequences of his actions. Yeah. And the game that he's playing with the Lord makes it really explicit, because he says, we're going to play a game, and I'm going to give you everything
that should have been another cute clue to him, that this is all connected.
And so it's made very clear that he's going to be expected to answer for his behavior and his actions. Yeah. And he's reluctant to do that.
Yeah. Do you think there was any you mentioned the parallel between sexual exploitation and exploitation of the natural world. Do you think that may have been why it was the lady of the castle who gives the little exposition on what green means, and kind of draws this idea that I don't remember exactly what you said, but I think the central theme was green is the color of nature, and we can't deny nature. When we die, we go back to nature. That green is always creeping in through moss and ivy and weeds, and it will just, if we don't actively trim it back, it will just reconsume everything we've constructed.
Yeah, I actually looked up that speech because it was so interesting to me, and it. So I'll just read a little bit of it. It says, whilst we're off looking for red, in comes green. Red is the color of lust, but green is what lust leaves behind in heart and womb. Green is what is left when ardor fades, when passion dies, when we die too. When you go, your footprints will fill with grass. Moss shall cover your tombstone, and as the sun rises, green shall spread over all, in all its shades and hues. This verdigris will overtake your swords and your coins and your battlements, and try as you might, all you hold dear will succumb to it. Your skin, your bones, your virtue.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That was pretty powerful. There is, and this wouldn't be this movie isn't the first place to suggest it, but I know there's always been parallels drawn between the Green Knight and the Green Man of more. Yeah, I don't know if I can't remember if the Green Man is unique to kind of Celtic folklore or if it's all over Europe. But the Green Man is sort of this personification of nature that shows up, and it's sort of a nature spirit.
Well, and this film really plays that up because he's a literal tree.
Yeah, he doesn't look like he's not just a green-skinned man in
Yeah.
armor. He's made of wood and roots and leaves, and
Yeah.
he kind of looks like, almost kind of looks like an Ent from Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
to a certain extent, made with a little more clearly human form. But that's come up quite a bit, and then there's the Green Knight from literature. But if you look over fantasy literature, a Green Knight, there are several authors that have sort of taken that and turned it into just a type of knight, or kind of nature-related, champion of nature, or something like that. There's actually a really interesting. I've only read the first series in the novel. It's called Priest by Matthew Colville. It's a pretty short novel. He self-publishes it on Amazon as a ebook, so I think you can print one too. But the first, it's kind of he calls it a fantasy hard-boiled, and it's this cleric who has to go investigate this murder among this order of Green Knights out in the woods, and they're all being like stoic and won't tell him things. And so it's almost like a hard-boiled detective novel, but it's in this fantasy world. But he curates a pretty neat mythology around the Green Knights in his setting, and it's clearly he's drawn on ideas from Dungeons and Dragons when he does that. But the Fae, the Oath of the Ancients Paladin, that they call them Green Knights in the player's handbook. The traditional paladin is a white knight, and they're Green Knights. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting idea that nature takes over, and I think that's a theme that comes up a lot it comes up a lot in a lot of literature, but I think particularly in fantasy literature, a lot of times that's the central conflict in a story is, humanity represents civilization and law and order and the construction of buildings and tilling of fields and domestication of animals and mastering nature. And then elves and fairies and brownies and creatures like that are more tied to the nature as it exists on its own. And there's this tension. I think it comes up. I don't know if you've read any of Powell Anderson's fantasy stuff, but particularly 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. That's kind of the central. Morgan Le Fay's the main villain in that. She doesn't appear, but she's like behind the sources of all these elves and fairy-like creatures who represent chaos. And then, the knights of, it's Charlemagne's peers, and they represent the forces of law, and there's this sort of tension between law and chaos because of, law. We're always trying to build things over nature, and nature is always pushing back. And I think here she's talking about in the movie, we know who's going to win in the end.
Right.
Eventually, we're all going to be gone, and everything we build we'll go back to nature.
But I also think that there's a sense that the answer is harmony, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not one force defeating or dominating the other. That what's essential is to find harmony and doing the right thing and being a good person to other people in the context of your community and the political power mm-hmm. that Arthur represents. That kind of moral, the morality there, and the morality with how you should interact with nature has the same core. Mm-hmm. And that he's really learning from the Green Knight that he needs to be open to that and move away from the desire to dominate nature and to dominate other people, and mm-hmm. move towards cooperation and harmony in all those areas.
Yeah. Well, I think if I understand, your Arthurian legend itself has that in it, because Arthur's sisters are, Le Fay literally means a fairy. Mm-hmm. They're really not completely human. Mm-hmm. They're his half sisters and the daughter of a mortal king, but they're also kind of, Fay in nature, and that's who he's in contest with, and where there's that I guess Mordred comes about and kind of undoes everything. Ultimately, is Morgaz's kind of final, I guess, revenge for the fact that that's kind of the world they had as children, and then their bastard half brother comes along, and Uther comes along and
Yeah.
They manage to get rid of Uther, but then his bastard son comes along and starts the whole thing over again. Let's see some of the other themes that I thought showed out. One, I like the puppet show. I just thought that was funny.
Oh,
The way they put the puppet show in there at the beginning. After at first when he takes up the night, everybody's like, "Yeah, go on, go away," and yeah, he's like the big hero, and everybody's looking forward. They've been cheering him on, and the puppet show kind of depicts him standing up to the Green Knight, and then a year goes by, and the puppet shows him basically just the Green Knight cutting his head off, and it's blood. The little red ribbons that represent blood coming out. It's pretty funny, but you see that in the passage of time that. At first, it's like, all right, this is his chance to really prove himself and be a knight. And then you get the sense the year goes by and he didn't do anything. He didn't train. He didn't.
No, he just like
he just kept drinking and partying.
Yes, he kept going to bars and people were buying him drinks.
And he really didn't. You think, well, I'm gonna have to get in shape. But you're expecting this Rocky montage. He's getting back to basics, and nope, he just. Waste the entire
like
year.
A rock star.
Yeah. So I like the puppet show and how that represented that kind of passage of time. The other thing was he has tell me your story. I mean, that's where it starts with Arthur. He's at the banquet, and Arthur suddenly realizes, this is my closest living relative, and I don't know him, and I think probably Arthur is thinking that he's probably going to be king when I'm gone because I don't have any kids. So he's like, well, come sit next to me. There's this chair that's empty, which I assume is supposed to be for either, I don't know who's supposed to, you think that was supposed to be for Merlin or Lancelot, or who's supposed to be the person that sits next to Arthur and Guinevere?
I was reading it as the heir that was to be put there.
Okay.
It was sitting empty.
Okay, so he asked him to come sit by, and then he says, "Well, I don't know you well enough. Tell me a story about yourself." And Gawain's like, I really don't have anything interesting to tell you about myself, And that's he kind of realizes, oh crap.
Yeah.
And then here comes the Green Knight to present him an opportunity to have a story to tell, and then he kind of milks that one story for a year,
right,
without really doing anything else of any value or of repute or anything like that. What did you think about it? That theme of tell me your story, or everybody has a story. I mean, he gets Winifred's story. He gets, does he get a story about Bertilac or the lady, or they're just kind of this nebulous.
They're kind of mysterious.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, I mean, one connection that I see is this connection of this like bigger cultural connection to us repeating and retelling and transforming these Arthurian tales over hundreds of years, right? This is a story that gave a kind of national identity at some point, and it still does in some ways, but as it's been changed over the years and been told in different contexts, even like the story of that national identity has changed.
Yeah.
And it's and the transformation of this legend, it represents how the community and the culture that embraces it is also changing.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think I love that element of tell me your story. And I love that Dev Patel is asked to tell it. And I think people have talked about unconventional casting, and I think that has to do with his race and his identity as a British Indian man. But he's just magnificent in this role.
Yeah. And
this is not the only cherished British story that Dev Patel has been part of telling.
Yeah.
Right? And
he's British, I mean.
Right. But he's also like, I think we had a conversation about this at another time. Then you mentioned that it makes you think of Hamilton.
Yeah.
In the way that we can have a tendency to very narrowly define who owns these stories. And when you have something like Hamilton, when you have racially diverse casting, and it helps people
people are still
embrace and own the stories that do belong to them, and it really emphasizes that this is your story too.
Yeah. There are currently people that are upset that Denzel Washington is going to play Macbeth.
Oh yeah,
like,
I haven't heard.
Really, one of the greatest actors of his generation is going to play Macbeth. That's that's going to be great. But yeah, I think that is true. That part of what I took away from Hamilton is why they cast only non-white people except for King George. Is to say that if we're Americans, this is our story as much as it is anybody else's. And so for British people who may not be of Caucasian ancestry to say, but we're still British, and this is part of the history of the culture that we are a part of and the society we live in. I think that's an interesting, thing that. And this movie was probably never intended to be historically accurate. It's a fantasy tale. It's a legend,
Yeah, and then I think also when he says, "I don't have any stories to tell," this is him very narrowly defining what's a worthy story to tell.
Yeah.
Right? Because he does have a life, and he has friends, and he has a romantic relationship that's important to him. Yep. He has a relationship with his mother that matters to him, and he doesn't tell any of those stories. Like he lives a life, but when they're asked like tell your story, and he can't, it really emphasizes that there's a very small subset of stories that we've deemed worthy to tell. Yeah. And he doesn't have anything that fits that mold. Mm-hmm. And part of the struggle he has with Arthur is that he has not been invited to sit at Arthur's side yet, because he doesn't really fit the mold of what Arthur expects from his heir, from his nephew.
Sorry, we've got a cat on the table that's demanding attention right now.
Because there's also an implication that Arthur is rejecting his sister. Yeah. And that is, and rejecting the responsibility that comes with having a nephew.
Yeah. Now, you'd mentioned in our earlier discussions the role of the uncle in the society in which this was portrayed. That the uncle was actually probably seen as more of the main person who was supposed to teach a boy how to be a man.
Yeah, it's a very important relationship between the uncle and the nephew. And in a lot of cases, it's especially the sister's son, as a very special, close relationship. And there's even some traditions of the nephew being in a line of inheritance before the son. Wow. That relationship between uncle and nephew is really central, in that sometimes young men would be like in their adolescence be sent to live with their uncle away from their father, because there's the idea that the father might favor him too much, might be too soft on him, and that the uncle would be responsible for really showing him what does it mean to be a man in the world. And so in that context, Arthur has a really powerful responsibility to going, and he has shirked it for his entire life.
Yeah, you get that. He kind of alludes to that, and he realizes he's failed him. I don't know if he says I failed you, but he kind of intimates that he's not done his job as his uncle. Was that a British thing, or was that more of a broad European?
It's a British thing, but that's not the only place where it shows up. It shows up in multiple cultures.
I know in Native American culture, I always attribute it more to just the broader sense of who is immediate family. But I know particularly in say in Cherokee culture, a man marries into his wife's family, and children's uncles and aunts are much more like secondary parents their mother siblings particularly tend to be much more traditionally. I mean, we don't live that way now necessarily, but we kind of do actually. Maybe not as explicitly, but I'd never known that was a part of the British or English tradition. What other cultures can do that?
I don't know. I can't say off the top of my head.
Well, that's something people can Google if they want to. I thought that was interesting. You mentioned, though, telling and retelling. I remember years ago reading about Robin Hood, and that Robin Hood, again, the story gets retold. He's originally just an outlaw, and then he becomes a displaced nobleman. But when he becomes a displaced nobleman, he's a Saxon noble who's been sort of done wrong by the Norman, people. And it was presented as though what they said is the Normans had their mythical hero in King Arthur. And so now the Saxons this was their response. The Saxons kind of turned Robin Hood into their cultural hero, which is interesting because Arthur is originally a Welsh character, and that he was kind of appropriated by, Thomas Malory was French, but it was kind of appropriated by the Franks who actually ruled England. And so they kind of made him their own cultural figure. So the characters get passed around from culture to culture, from people to people, and the story takes on a different meaning, I guess, every time it does. Let's see, what other themes did I have here? Oh, he has visions. There's a couple times, again, at some point you start to wonder, is this really happening, or is he having a dream? There's a scene after he gets robbed and they tie him up and take his stuff where he just kind of, there's this kind of 360-degree camera angle pans around, and then you see this decay. It's just it's Gawain's skeleton laying there in his clothes, and he kind of sees himself dead there. And then I don't know if that kind of motivates him to try a little harder to get out of his out of the bonds and not lay there die by tied up to a tree. And then there's the fox starts following him. Mm-hmm. He starts seeing this fox, and it's just kind of like the fox is there. But then they eat some psychedelic mushrooms. They're holed up in a cave during a thunderstorm, and then that's where the real fantastical elements. It's after that he sees these giants kind of strolling across the landscape, and everything becomes a little more surreal. And you're like, is he still tripping, or is this really happening? And then even at the castle, I'm like, well, is he really at a castle, or is he still on some kind of psychedelic, trip? But one thing I noticed was this is much more of there's a scene in the beginning in Camelot where you see this map on Arthur's table, supposedly the map of the realm, and it has no bearing whatsoever. It looks nothing like the actual British Isles. So I thought, I think there's a little cue there that this really isn't historical Britain.
This is a
fantasy world. I was wondering what you thought of that, about how much of this was a fantasy movie versus how much was this an adaptation of literature.
Well, I think that it's definitely a fantasy movie, and but there's plenty of magic in the source poem, right? True. But and then you kind of, if you're going to adapt it into a film, there's lots of directions you can go, and it'd be really easy to turn this into like an action adventure, right?
Well, taking out the magic is where you got that King Arthur movie with Clive.
Yeah, and this is not an action flick, right?
Yeah,
and
that was the only bad review I saw online. I was looking at the reviews, and it was just like this was amazing. Oh, like this, he's got to win an Oscar. Blah, blah, blah. And then the only bad review was some guy who was, I guess he was going and expecting to see medieval Avengers, or something like that.
Well, I had two friends of mine talk to me about this movie in the same week, and you were one of them. And you reached out to say, or you posted something on Facebook to say, like, this is an incredible film, and you should really go watch it. And I was really blown away, and you had great things to say about it. And I thought, great, I was excited about this. BJ loved it. I'm gonna go see it. And then the next day, I talked to another friend who was like, I saw the worst movie last night. It was so long. It was so boring. Nothing happened. And I thought that really, so after I watched it, I was like, I'm still in. BJ likes it, I'm still in. And I think that really puts a fine point on what this adaptation does. It really leans into the fantasy. This is it's builds a world of magic and fantasy, and anything's possible, and it's a really like visually beautiful experience, and it's meditative in that.
Yeah,
like there's
there's a lot of scenes with no dialogue and with very little sound.
Yeah,
they're just kind of blank, and it's just the visuals, you know.
Yeah, and I sort
a lot
of
of white
like
noise.
those the psychedelic kind of scenes. I think of as being open to possibility and changing your worldview, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gawain's whole understanding of the world needs to be transformed, and so he needs to move through this world in which anything is possible, and so he can reach enlightenment. It to me, there's kind of that element of like psychedelic enlightenment in there.
What do you think the fox represented? I mean, we talked about this a little bit. Of the fox at first seems to be some sort of spirit guide. You know, every time he follows the fox, he gets closer to where he's supposed to be. But then when he finally gets to what he's supposed to do, the fox kind of berates him and abandons him. So I didn't. I kind of wondered what that meant. That.
Yeah, the fox is a fun little character, and I love that he talks. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't, in the source poem, I went back looking for a fox. I didn't reread the poem, but I did go back looking for a fox because I knew I didn't recall that. And there's kind of a big, long hunting scene that isn't really built into the film. And there's, as the Lord of the Castle goes out and he's trying to hunt, this fox keeps escaping him. Mm-hmm. He's really crafty and wily. Yeah. And it's mirroring the seduction attempts that as the lady is trying to snare Gawain, the Lord is trying to snare the fox. Mm-hmm. And they keep avoiding it and like tricking them to get out of it, and finally they're caught.
He sees the paintings of that in the movie when he's looking at the tapestries. I wonder if that's kind of interesting then, because in the movie he finally gives in to the lady's attempts to seduce him, and then when he comes out to meet Bertilac has finally caught the fox and gives him the fox. But then Bertilac also knows he's lying about, you got something else. What else did you which that would have been an interesting scene to see.
So if you think about it, if I'm thinking back on this film after looking at the fox as a double for Gawain, it's maybe in some ways like his conscience, his struggle playing out, and his kind of inner conflict that has been represented in this external creature that he can argue with explicitly.
Yeah. It's got the little angel and devil on your shoulder.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I wanted to point out is in terms of ending, and the movie ends with the Green Knight making his final swing, and then he stops his axe and he leans down and he says, what does he say? He says, let's take that head off or something. I mean, he says what he says in the poem, which in the poem is clearly revealed to be a joke. But in the movie just ends with, Gawain just submitting to, he takes the sash off and says, I was trying to cheat, but I can't do that. And then the knight just says, okay, well then it's, off with your head. And that's the end of the movie. Yeah. You don't see so in the movie you're left going, well, was that the joke? Was he like, okay, you passed, so, I'm just going to kind of nick you and let you go like it happened in the poem? Or is he really going to cut his head off, because prior to that, Gawain has this huge vision of what's going to happen if he runs away. He's going to go back, he's going to lie, they're going to make him king, and then the whole kingdom crumbles because he's not been it shows him just engaging in more dishonorable, he uses this woman that he's had a relationship with, the prostitute, just to produce his own heir. Then he marries another woman and takes the baby away, and it just shows him doing more awful things until the whole kingdom collapses under his rule. But that's just a vision of what's going to happen if he doesn't learn how to be an honorable, honest person. And so then he takes the sash off. It's like, I'm not going to cheat. And that's that's the end of the movie. Off with your head.
Which, like that, the moment when he decides, I'm going to take off this sash, should be his redemption, right? Yeah. So we've seen the worst timeline, like the most negative timeline, and now we want to go back and see that he's been redeemed and that he has a good life, but we don't get to see that. We don't get to see that, but we can feel good about the fact that he gave up the sash.
That made me think about more, and I'm not an expert on this, but like the samurai culture, where the idea is, you have to fight like hell to not die. But it's more of a challenge, a struggle with death. It's like, I'm prepared to die at any moment in an honorable way, but I'm not going to make it easy on death. Mm-hmm. I've also got to go down fighting.
Yeah.
There's kind of that element there. Is the point is he regained his honor. Right. It isn't whether he went back and was a hero or what happened afterward. It's just the point is that he did the right thing, and he whether he dies or whether he lives, he completed kind of his hero's journey to become an honorable, kind of fully grown, fully functioning adult. But yeah, I'm right. I was kind of like, well, I kind of want to see what happens, and I was like, well, I guess that wasn't the point of this movie. So I was still very satisfied with the ending, though, even though it didn't show that. Did you have other? That's kind of all my. I had some notes of things I wanted to touch on. Were there other things you wanted to speak to? Any final thoughts other than everybody should go watch the movie?
Yeah. I really enjoyed this. I think that as a retelling of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, well, maybe that's one last thing to talk about. The Sir Gawain's name is not in the title of the film.
Yeah.
And he's not really called Sir Gawain, that I recall, because he's not a knight yet.
Yeah, he's not a knight.
Right? Yeah. He's not a knight, and so he wants to be. And that's one of the things that we don't get to see is his success as a knight. And so the Green Knight is the title character, even though we don't actually see the Green Knight that often.
Yeah, he's got like 2 scenes.
Yeah. And so I kind of like your suggestion that maybe not all of this has happened in reality, that this has been a kind of vision, because then maybe Gawain is the title character. The Green Knight is part of him too. Yeah. It's this struggle that he has with himself and who he's supposed to be in the world. Yeah. And the Green Knight represents all of these things that he's struggling with.
Yeah. Okay. So you said you felt like maybe he is the Green Knight, like the Green Knight is the title character, not Gawain, but maybe the Green Knight is just an aspect of himself, and this has all been a vision, and he's looking at every character he encounters is just some facet of himself.
Yeah, like a manifestation of his struggle that he has been. He's, when we first see him in the first scene, he's denying a lot. He's just avoiding responsibility, probably avoiding contemplation and thinking about who he is and who he's supposed to be as an adult, and his responsibilities to the people that he has relationships with. And then his mother, nudges those things out of him. So puts them, takes these internal struggles that he's avoiding and puts them right in his face. So he can no longer avoid it. He's got to take it on. He's got to look at it directly. And so this kind of final confrontation between Gawain and the Green Knight is between Gawain and his better self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's interesting because, obviously when you analyze a movie like this, you think of the hero's journey and of different archetypes, which is Joseph Campbell, but he's working off the works of Carl Jung. And Carl Jung said that when we have a dream, every person we encounter in the dream is just a version of ourselves. We may perceive it as a parent or a friend or some character that was just made up for the purpose of the dream. And so when Jungian therapists do dream analysis with people, that's one, and I'm not trained to do that. I just have read this, but that's part of what they're doing is looking at, well, what do you remember about the dream? What stands out? Who stands out in it? And what part of yourself does that represent? That your dreams are a conversation with yourself as you're trying to work out something that is bothering you or that is important to you or that has meaning for you. So that would be an interesting idea that this has all been sort of a Jungian analysis of Gawain having a dream about what he's really supposed to be, who he really is. But or again, he's just having a funky trip on psychedelic mushrooms. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I like this story. I like this movie.
Yeah, I think everybody. It's not a movie for kids. There's some intense stuff. But yeah, if you're old enough to see an R-rated movie, it's a good movie. But again, it is a character study, not an action movie. So, it's an A24 art movie, not a Sony Pictures action movie. All right. Well, thanks for coming over and talking about this. I appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. This is fun.
Yeah. So I'll put this together and we'll get it out for people to listen to. All right. Well, you're right, folks. I've been talking to Dr. Sarah Peters of East Central University in Ada, Oklahoma. And thanks again for being here. And hope you guys that listen to this enjoy it. And I'll be back again with another episode at some point in the near future. And that's it for this episode of The Arcane Alienist. I want to thank Dave Bone for the cover art that I use for the episodes. Check out ironseer.com. And the music is Come and Get It by Scott Holmes Music. Thank you for listening. Give me a call sometime through the Anchor app or at the Anchor website. And I'll be back in the future with another episode.